It was May 16th, 1992, a warm Saturday night that smelled like lilacs and asphalt after rain. In Lincoln County, Ohio, the entire town seemed to orbit around the high school gymnasium that evening. It was prom night, the last real night of youth before graduation, scattered everyone in different directions. Inside the lakeside banquet hall, the air shimmered with cheap disco lights, cologne, and the pulse of 90s pop songs. Joseph Mulvaney, 18, wasn't much of a dancer, but that night he looked lighter than usual, his silver gray tux crisp, his hair slicked back, smiling at his friends across the room. William Hamilton, his best friend since Little League, was teasing him from the snack table, while Nikki Bacolis, quiet, bright-eyed, with a pink silk dress and a pearl bracelet she'd borrowed from her mother, was laughing harder than she had in months. The three had been inseparable since middle school. They grew up on the same streets, studied for the same exams, shared the same diner booth every weekend. That night, they were on top of the world. At around 11:45 p.m., they said their goodbyes, waving to classmates clustered under the parking lot lights. Joseph jingled his keys, joking that he was the designated chauffeur of bad decisions, and the three climbed into his silver '89 Pontiac Grand Prix. Their plan was simple: head to the overlook by Miller's Lake, take a few photos, maybe listen to music before curfew. They never made it home. By morning, their parents assumed they'd overslept or stayed with friends. But by noon, worry had begun to ripple through the neighborhood. None of the three had shown up for work, and their beds were still neatly made. Nikki's mother, Eleni, called the Hamiltons first, then the Mulvaneys. When she realized none of them knew where the kids were, her voice cracked. By that evening, the police were notified. At first, the responding officers treated it like a harmless post-prom adventure. Kids disappeared for a weekend every year around graduation. A camping trip, a runaway scare, a teenage rebellion. "They'll turn up," one officer said. But by Sunday night, when every phone call, every lead, every friend had been checked, that optimism turned to something colder. On Monday morning, the search began. Dozens of volunteers lined the back roads between the banquet hall and the lake. The sheriff's department sent patrol cars down old logging trails. Bloodhounds were brought in, noses pressed against photos of the missing. Helicopters circled the rural roads, their searchlights brushing over cornfields, ponds, and ravines. Nothing. No skid marks, no debris, no trace of a crash. The Pontiac was gone, as if swallowed whole by the dark. The parents clung to routine. Joseph's father drove his old pickup back and forth along Route 39, checking every ditch and gully. William's older brother hung flyers at every truck stop and gas station from Lincoln to Columbus. Nikki's mother sat by the phone, writing down every anonymous tip that came in. A girl seen at a diner, a car matching the description near the river, a rumor about a party in the woods. Every call ended in silence. By the end of the week, the community gathered at St. John's Church for a vigil. Rows of candles flickered under the stained glass windows, each flame trembling against the draft. Local reporters came, snapping pictures of 3 framed senior portraits at the altar, smiling faces frozen in a night that would never end. Police reopened the map of the county again and again, tracing the same routes with their pens, from the banquet hall to Miller's Lake, from the lake to Route 12, from Route 12 to the Mulvaney driveway. They were sure they'd miss something, a turn, a hidden path, a stretch of road too dark to see. But there was nothing to miss. When the first week ended, the headlines changed. 3 teens vanish after prom night. The case caught regional attention, spreading through Ohio like static. People whispered about carjackings, abductions, even a runaway pact. Theories were endless, but none fit. For the families, time stopped. The school year ended, summer began, and the town kept moving. But for 3 homes in Lincoln County, life became a frozen clock. Stuck at 11:45 p.m. on May 16th, 1992. The moment a silver Pontiac rolled out of the lakeside parking lot and into oblivion. Every passing day made hope harder to hold. In August, a fisherman found tire tracks near the edge of Bell Creek, 2 faint impressions that disappeared into the mud. But divers came up empty. Later that fall, hunters reported seeing a flash of metal deep in a ravine near Route 60, but it turned out to be a rusted refrigerator. Nothing led anywhere. By the end of the year, the sheriff quietly admitted to the families what everyone already feared. There were no new leads, no physical evidence, no witnesses. "It's like the earth just opened up and swallowed them," he said. But to the parents, to the siblings, the teachers, the friends, it wasn't over. They couldn't accept that 3 teenagers, a car, and every trace of their existence could vanish into thin air. Somewhere out there, they believed, was an answer. Buried under water, hidden under soil, or locked behind someone's silence. And even though they didn't know it yet, that silence would last 24 long years. By the second week, the word missing no longer felt temporary. The search for the 3 seniors, Joseph Mulvaney, William Hamilton, and Nikki Bacoles, had shifted from a frantic hunt to something quieter, heavier. Investigators widened their radius, tracing every road, bridge, and creek bed in Lincoln County. The missing car, Joseph Silver, 1989 Pontiac Grand Prix, had become the key. Detectives repeated its description in every broadcast and press release. 2-door coupe, metallic, gray license plate 4G2971. But for all the talk, for all the ground covered, there wasn't a single confirmed sighting. It was as if both the car and its passengers had been erased. Helicopters crisscrossed the skies that summer, scanning riverbanks and quarries where local teens were known to gather. Divers were sent into muddy ponds along Miller's Lake, dragging the murky depths for any glint of silver. Officers probed sinkholes, drainage culverts, even abandoned farm silos. Each time, reporters hovered at the edge of the tape, waiting for answers that never came. The only constant was the silence, the stillness that followed every failed search. Rumors began to spread like wildfire through the small town. At the diner, someone claimed Nikki's ex-boyfriend had shown up to prom that night, angry and drunk. Another swore they'd overheard teenagers at a gas station talking about a crash cover-up, that the kids had been drinking and someone powerful was helping hide it. There were whispers of a runaway pact, that the 3 had planned to start over somewhere far away. It was gossip layered on grief, each new theory more desperate than the last. Detectives chased every lead. They interviewed classmates who'd last seen the trio on the dance floor, waiters from the banquet hall, even the gas station clerk who sold them soda an hour before they vanished. One by one, the statements overlapped, contradicted, then collapsed under scrutiny. Nothing fit. There were no confirmed witnesses beyond the parking lot. The kids had left in the Pontiac, and from that moment on, the trail went cold. The families, refusing to sit still, organized search parties that lasted deep into summer. Volunteers combed through cornfields and wooded ridgelines with flashlights and dogs, shouting names into the dark. They posted flyers on telephone poles, in grocery stores, at rest stops. For weeks, the 3 faces, smiling, innocent, frozen in senior photos, watched over the town like ghosts. At St. John's Church, where the first vigil had been held, a table of candles was kept lit long after most people moved on. Each week, someone new would stop by to relight a wick, leave a note, or whisper a prayer. Joseph's mother came every Sunday at dawn. William's father, who rarely spoke in public, stood in the back pew and never once looked up. Nikki's mother, Eleni, refused to pack away her daughter's things. Her room remained untouched, prom dress still hanging on the closet door, hairbrush on the dresser, calendar frozen on May 1992. The investigation kept moving on paper, if not in reality. The sheriff's department kept the case file open, adding small updates. A sighting in Kentucky that turned out false, a vehicle report that led to an impound lot in Michigan, an anonymous letter that said nothing useful. Months turned to seasons. When fall came, the lake where they were last seen shimmered with fog and people stopped going near it, after dark. By winter, the case had become part of local folklore. Kids dared each other to drive out to Miller's Lake and park near the overlook. They said you could still see headlights flicker on the water some nights, or hear faint music from a car radio beneath the wind. For the parents, those stories were unbearable. For the teenagers, they were a way to make sense of what couldn't be explained. In early 1993, a new detective was assigned, a younger officer named David Kirby, eager to make a name for himself. He reviewed everything, the 911 calls, the search grids, the tire track photographs. He requested aerial maps from the state archives, thinking maybe a patch of forest or a new development had covered the car. He found nothing, but he noticed something others had overlooked, a section of the industrial park being built just a mile and a half from the banquet hall. At the time of the disappearance, it was under construction. Fresh concrete had been poured that same week. Kirby jotted the detail down but never pursued it further. There was no reason to suspect anything unusual. The idea of a car being buried under a foundation was unthinkable. By summer of that year, the search fund had dried up. The billboards were taken down. Reporters stopped calling. When the high school class of '93 graduated, an empty row of seats was left open for Joseph, William, and Nikki. A bouquet of lilies lay across them. The ceremony ended, and the crowd applauded softly before filing out into the June heat. Life slowly returned to normal, but for the families, time stood still. William's mother refused to sell his 1986 pickup, leaving it parked under the maple tree in their yard, the windshield collecting leaves. Every few weeks she started the engine just to hear it run. Joseph's brother, Mark, joined the military, but whenever he came home, he'd drive the back roads late at night, convinced he could find something the police missed. And Nikki's father, who'd once been the town's loudest voice for justice, grew quiet. His house fell into disrepair, curtains drawn, front porch light always burning. By the end of 1993, the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department officially downgraded the investigation to inactive. The case file was boxed, labeled, and moved to the cold case room, a small, dim office filled with forgotten tragedies. Over time, newer cases pushed it further back. The years blurred. New officers replaced old ones. The original investigators retired. A few locals still remembered the missing teens when the anniversary rolled around. But for most, it became another ghost story. One of those unsolved small-town mysteries everyone talked about, but no one really believed would ever be solved. The bulletin board inside the sheriff's office said it all. Dozens of faces pinned under yellowed plastic sleeves, runaways, missing hunters, lost children. In the corner, near the Almis bottom, were 3 photos. Joseph, William, Nikki. The ink had faded, the corners curling with age. They'd been there so long that the pushpins left rust stains on the cork. By the time 1994 came and went, no one was looking anymore. The families had stopped calling. The reporters had stopped asking. But in Lincoln County, on quiet nights when the air settled and the roads fell silent, some swore you could still hear an engine in the distance, the low hum of a Pontiac disappearing down a road that never ended. By the late 90s, the case had shifted from a headline to a story people whispered about at diners and school football games. The name everyone gave it was the prom vanishings. For kids who grew up in Lincoln County, it wasn't just a mystery, it was a warning. Every teenager who drove those back roads knew the story of the 3 seniors who left the banquet hall one spring night and never came back. Their photos still hung on the high school's memorial wall, sun-faded and curling at the edges. A whole generation had passed through that building since 1992, but the names Joseph Mulvaney, William Hamilton, and Nikki Bacoles never disappeared from conversation. They were reminders of how quickly normal could turn into nightmare. With no evidence, the story took on a life of its own. Some said the kids had crashed into one of the deeper lakes, the ones that stretched for miles underground, where sonar couldn't reach. Others claimed they'd been abducted by someone passing through, maybe a trucker, maybe a drifter, who vanished just as easily. A few went darker, whispering about cover-ups, that maybe someone with influence in the county had buried the truth to protect their own. The most popular theory came from local fishermen, who swore that a car had gone off an access road near Miller's Quarry. Divers searched it twice in the mid-90s, but came up empty. Still, the rumors persisted, because rumors are all a small town has when evidence runs out. The families carried their own kind of silence. They lived in the same houses, drove the same roads their children once did, always scanning the tree lines for something. A shimmer of metal, a shape, a sign. Every year on May 16th, they gathered at St. John's Church to relight the candles and read their children's names aloud. Fewer people came as time went on, but the parents kept showing up. Hope doesn't vanish just because time passes. It only gets quieter. In 2001, nearly a decade after the disappearance, a retired detective named Dale Roper decided to reopen the old wound. Roper had been young when the case broke, just a patrol officer then, but it had haunted him. Now, in his 60s, he spent most of his retirement combing through unsolved cases for the county, and one tip caught his attention. A man who'd worked construction in the early 90s came forward saying there used to be a service road off Route 39 that wasn't on any current maps. It ran behind the old quarry before the land was developed. He said it had been closed off and buried under fill years later, but he remembered a steep drop and soft soil, the kind of place a car could disappear. Roper called in a few favors. In August of that year, he and 2 deputies brought cadaver dogs to the area. They walked the overgrown trail, cutting through weeds taller than their heads, until they reached a patch of uneven ground. The dogs sniffed the perimeter, circling again and again, but gave no signal. The soil was disturbed in places, but the pattern matched erosion, not a burial. They took soil samples, checked for paint or metal fragments, even scanned the area with a borrowed ground-penetrating radar. Nothing. Roper drove home that night, frustrated but convinced they'd been close. If it happened anywhere, he told a local reporter weeks later, it happened near that quarry. But no funding came for further digs. It was another dead end in a case built on them. For the families, every failed lead cut deeper. Nikki's mother, Eleni, refused to let the story die. In 2002, she launched a small awareness campaign called Remember the Three. She sold t-shirts, passed out flyers, and spoke on regional talk shows. Her voice was steady on camera, but behind the scenes, friends said she'd become a different person. Consumed, almost mechanical in her mission. Every May she called the sheriff's office, asking if there was anything new. Every year they gave her the same answer. Joseph's brother, Mark, took a different path. In 2003, he joined the sheriff's department as a deputy, telling friends he wanted to keep the file alive. He requested access to the case folder every chance he got, reviewing the maps and photos in the dim light of his patrol office after shifts. His colleagues said he was methodical, not hopeful, but determined. When a wrecked car was pulled from a river or a license plate turned up in a salvage yard, Mark was the first to volunteer to check it out. He never found anything that connected back to the Grand Prix, but he refused to stop trying. Time, though, has a way of erasing evidence even when memories stay sharp. By the mid-2000s, Lincoln County had changed. The roads were wider, the land flatter, and most of the old industrial zones were gone. The quarry that once drew suspicion was being repurposed for development, its edges smoothed, its access roads sealed under fresh asphalt. Construction crews poured new foundations over forgotten dirt, turning once desolate land into housing lots. Nobody thought to cross-reference those locations with old missing person files. Nobody realized what was being paved over. For the parents, each change felt like losing their children all over again. The lake overlook where the trio was last seen had become a rest area with picnic tables. The banquet hall closed in 2004, the building left to rot until it was torn down. Even the high school, once full of memorial plaques and photos, renovated its hallways. The past was vanishing piece by piece, replaced by parking lots, playgrounds, and concrete. By 2010, the case was nearly forgotten outside the families. Only the occasional article brought it back, usually around anniversaries. But for those who lived through it, the loss never dulled. Nikki's father died in 2012, still sleeping in the bedroom across from hers. Eleni kept living in the same house, her daughter's room preserved like a museum. The walls smelled faintly of her old perfume. Mark Mulvaney, now a seasoned officer, admitted in an interview that he no longer expected to find them alive. At this point, he said, I just want to bring them home. His words echoed through the county, reigniting the story briefly. But it would still take another 6 years before anyone realized the truth had been under their feet the entire time. As developers broke ground near Dry Creek Industrial Park in 2016, the same land once tied to the old quarry, the machinery struck something solid beneath the concrete. Workers thought it was piping, maybe an old tank, but the metal gleamed through the dust in a familiar, unmistakable curve. What they unearthed wasn't a pipe, it was the roof of a car that had been sealed in concrete for more than 2 decades. Every case on this channel isn't just a story. It's weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. Each episode takes nearly 15 days of research and long nights chasing the truth. We do this because these stories matter, and someone out there still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, please take a second to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support keeps us going. And if you want to watch more solved cold cases, the links are waiting for you in the description below. Now, let's get back to the case. It was late July 2016, a humid Ohio morning that started like any other for the crew working off Dry Creek Road. The site was part of an old industrial lot being prepped for redevelopment. The men had been there for weeks, tearing out cracked concrete and rusted fencing, replacing the skeleton of what used to be a small factory parking area. To anyone passing by, it looked routine. Machines rumbling, dust hanging in the air, the rhythmic clang of metal. But beneath that forgotten stretch of pavement, something waited. Around 10:45 a.m., one of the backhoe operators, a man named Raymond Heller, felt his machine jolt. He thought he'd hit reinforced rebar, or maybe a buried fuel tank. He tried again, the bucket clanging against something solid. It didn't sound like pipe. The foreman came over, waved him to stop, and they started digging by hand. As they chipped away the remaining concrete, a metallic glint appeared under the dust. It wasn't a pipe, it was a roof, and not the flat kind. It curved. At first, the crew thought it might be an old storage container, something left from the factory days. But when the light hit just right, they saw the faded shimmer of silver paint. One of them brushed the dust off and felt the outline of a windshield frame. Then, a door seam. Within minutes, they realized they weren't standing over an industrial relic. They were standing over a buried car. The foreman radioed it into the county sheriff's office. Deputies arrived, roped off the site, and halted all work. Excavation teams were called in to carefully expose the rest of the structure. As the machines peeled back layers of concrete and soil, the shape became undeniable. A compact two-door coupe, crushed and sealed beneath nearly 2 feet of hardened cement. The make and model weren't visible yet, but what they could see was clear. This car had been entombed deliberately. By evening, the entire lot was flooded with law enforcement and media. Floodlights illuminated the scene as investigators examined the remains of the vehicle, half sunken in the earth. The VIN number was still partially legible. When an officer ran it through the database, everyone standing near him fell silent. The number matched a 1989 Pontiac Grand Prix registered to Joseph Mulvaney, the same Joseph who'd vanished after prom night in 1992, 24 years earlier. News spread fast. Within hours, Lincoln County was swarming with reporters. Camera vans lined Dry Creek Road. By the next morning, every major outlet in the region had picked up the story. Car linked to 1992, prom night disappearance found buried under concrete. For a town that had carried the ghost of this case for decades, it was like the clock had been rewound. The car was carefully extracted in sections to preserve the evidence. The body was twisted and crushed inward, as though it had been lowered into a confined pit before the concrete was poured around it. When forensic teams opened the door panels and sifted through the interior, they found human remains. 3 skeletons seated as if frozen in time. The driver's seat still held the remnants of a tuxedo jacket, buttons tarnished but intact. Beside it, in the passenger seat, a bracelet glinted faintly under the forensic lights, a delicate silver band engraved with the initials NB. In the back seat, they found what was left of a class ring inscribed W.H. Lincoln High, 1992. Among the wreckage lay fragments of a cassette case and magnetic tape, the kind teenagers used to record mixtapes for road trips. The forensic team labeled each item with trembling hands. These weren't artifacts. They were answers, and reminders of 3 lives that never made it home. By evening, the sheriff's department held a press conference outside the old industrial park. Families stood behind the barricades, silent, clutching each other as the sheriff confirmed what they had feared and longed for in equal measure. The vehicle recovered from the site is confirmed to be the one belonging to Joseph Mulvaney, he said. 3 sets of remains have been located within. Positive identification is pending DNA confirmation. For the Mulvaney, Hamilton, and Bacoles families, the world seemed to collapse and steady all at once. For 24 years, they'd lived with the not knowing, a kind of limbo that left them unable to mourn or move forward. Now, they had something tangible. They had proof their children hadn't run away. They hadn't disappeared by choice. But as the reality sank in, so did the questions. How did a full-sized vehicle end up under a poured slab of concrete on a property that, records showed, had been developed in 1993, a full year after the three were reported missing? Who had access to the site at the time? And why had no one noticed the buried car when the foundation was first poured? Detectives began re-examining old files, timelines, and land records. The discovery site was less than 2 miles from the banquet hall where the teens were last seen. In 1992, that stretch of land had been a gravel yard used by local contractors. By mid-1993, it had become part of a small manufacturing complex. The foundation where the car was found matched an expansion that had been rushed to completion that same summer. Within days, search warrants were issued for the original property records and business permits. Investigators learned that the slab had been poured by a construction company called Henders & Sons Contracting, one that no longer existed. The company's owner, Paul Henders, had fled the state in the mid-90s amid unrelated financial crimes. The connection was thin, but it was enough to reopen the entire investigation. Forensic experts examined the car closely. There was no evidence of an external collision, no signs that it had been struck or forced off the road. The undercarriage was intact. The wheels were turned slightly left, suggesting it had been driven into a confined space voluntarily or under control. Inside, the gear shift was still in neutral, and the keys were in the ignition. The scene looked less like an accident and more like a burial. News coverage exploded. National outlets picked up the story, dubbing it the concrete car mystery. For weeks, Lincoln County became the center of a long-forgotten nightmare. Former classmates were interviewed. The retired detective, Dale Roper, who had once searched the quarry just half a mile away, told reporters he wasn't surprised. "We were always close," he said quietly, "just didn't dig in the right place." The emotional impact was devastating. Nikki's mother, Eleni, who had spent decades begging for answers, collapsed during the press briefing. William's sister described feeling hollow, like the past 20 years had just played backwards. Joseph's brother, now a deputy, stood among the officers processing the scene. He didn't speak to the press, but witnesses said he stayed there long after the others left, just standing near the exposed vehicle, staring at what remained of the car he'd once washed with his brother on summer weekends. For the families, closure didn't feel like peace. It felt like confirmation of their worst fears, and the beginning of new ones. Because if the car had been buried intentionally, someone had done it. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure it would never be found. And as investigators studied the records of that construction site, the permits, the blueprints, the names listed on payroll in the summer of 1993, one name began to appear over and over again. It was a man who had vanished almost as completely as the three seniors themselves. When the discovery made headlines in 2016, the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department had no choice but to reopen the file. What had once been a mystery frozen in rumor was now physical evidence: a car, 3 bodies, and a timeline that no longer made sense. The forensic reconstruction began immediately. Specialists from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation were brought in to analyze how a full-sized vehicle could end up buried under an industrial foundation. Their findings were as strange as they were disturbing. The undercarriage of the Pontiac was intact. There were no skid marks, no crushed fenders, no evidence of a high-impact crash. The chassis damage was minimal, consistent with being dropped or lowered into place rather than forced in by impact. Soil samples from the pit wall showed it had once been open ground, loose fill, the kind used to backfill construction sites before concrete is poured. That meant the car wasn't part of an accident. It was placed there. Toxicology reports offered little clarity. Chemical traces in the bone marrow revealed low levels of ethanol, consistent with a few drinks, maybe a toast at prom night, but nowhere near enough to suggest the driver had lost control. In every measurable way, the evidence pointed away from the teenagers being responsible for what happened. Someone else had moved that car. Someone had buried it. Detectives retraced the paper trail of the property itself, pulling county permits, inspection records, and old blueprints. What they found deepened the mystery. The section of the lot where the Pontiac was found had been poured in June 1993, 13 months after the teens vanished. At that time, the land was owned by a local contractor named Paul Henders. His company, Henders & Sons Contracting, had been a small but busy outfit known for taking quick industrial jobs across southern Ohio. On paper, the job seemed routine, a foundation pour for an expansion to a storage warehouse. But the timing, the location, and the rushed work logs raised every red flag possible. The sheriff's office began looking into Hender's history. It didn't take long to learn that he'd fled the state in 1994 after being investigated for fraud and embezzlement. He'd left a trail of lawsuits and unpaid employees behind him. One of those former employees, a foreman named Richard Tully, had since retired in Florida. When detectives reached him, he didn't hesitate. He remembered that particular job well. He said a section of concrete had been poured overnight, unplanned and against schedule, because Henders insisted on finishing before an upcoming inspection. Tully described how the site lights had been on past midnight, and how Henders himself had shown up with another man, someone not on the crew list. They mixed additional concrete on site, using rented equipment, and refused to let anyone near that portion of the lot until the next morning. When the crew returned, the ground was already sealed. "I didn't ask questions," Tully admitted. "We were paid cash for that weekend." That single statement changed everything. Investigators now believed the car hadn't accidentally fallen into a pit. It had been lowered, deliberately, methodically, covered, and sealed. The question was why. When the FBI was consulted, they confirmed it would have taken heavy machinery to accomplish such a burial, the kind available to construction crews. A crane or backhoe could easily lower a vehicle into an open foundation before a pour, and if done at night, without permits, it could vanish in less than a day. Henders became the prime suspect almost instantly. Detectives tracked him down to a modest home in rural Arkansas, where he'd lived quietly since leaving Ohio. He was 68 years old now, retired, remarried, and reportedly in poor health. When two investigators arrived at his door, he seemed calm but visibly shaken when they mentioned Lincoln County. He admitted he'd worked the Dry Creek site, but denied ever seeing a vehicle there. He claimed the overnight pour had been ordered by the client, not him. Still, the inconsistencies in his story mounted quickly. Records showed he had signed off on the concrete order that weekend. No client approval existed. Forensic accountants found no trace of payment for that extra load of material. When asked to take a polygraph, he agreed, and failed on the very first question related to the burial. The report noted physiological responses, consistent with deception. Investigators prepared to build a case for obstruction and possible homicide accessory charges. But before they could move forward, Henders' health declined rapidly. He suffered a cardiac event less than 4 months after the interview and died at home before any formal indictment could be filed. With his death, the investigation hit another wall. Some believed he had acted alone, perhaps covering up an accident that happened near the site. Others thought he was protecting someone, maybe a worker, maybe a local official. But without direct testimony, the motive dissolved into speculation. Still, the forensic team remained convinced this was no random tragedy. The clean placement of the vehicle, the perfectly aligned slab, the absence of panic or damage inside the car, all of it suggested calculated intent. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase 3 young lives, and they had almost succeeded. For the families, it was another cruel turn. The answers they'd begged for now pointed toward a man who could no longer face justice. Joseph's brother called it a confession buried under concrete. Nikki's mother, Eleni, said she believed more people knew, that someone in that town helped cover it up, whether out of loyalty or fear. As the investigators boxed up the final evidence and logged the case back into the cold file archive, they couldn't shake one haunting realization. The section of concrete that hid the car had been inspected and approved in 1993 by a county building supervisor, a man who lived less than a mile from the Mulvaney home. He'd signed the final paperwork, declaring the slab secure and complete. Whether he'd missed what was beneath him or simply looked away, no one ever found out. In the spring of 2017, the official conclusion finally arrived. After months of forensic testing, a reconstruction, and public speculation, investigators ruled the deaths of Joseph Mulvaney, William Hamilton, and Nikki Bacolos as accidental but suspicious. The report read like a compromise between evidence and unease, a narrative that made sense on paper, but not in the hearts of those who had waited 25 years for an explanation. According to the official theory, after leaving prom that night in 1992, the three friends had somehow taken a wrong turn down an unfinished service road near the edge of the Dry Creek development zone. The road, still under construction, ended abruptly at a drainage pit where concrete work was set to begin that week. Investigators believed the car may have slipped down the incline, landing nose first into the pit and becoming trapped. Days later, unaware that anything was there, workers poured the concrete foundation, entombing the vehicle and its passengers forever. On paper, it was neat. It accounted for the car, for the timing, for the location, but to the people who knew those kids, it didn't sit right. Not with the families, and not with many of the detectives who'd lived with the case for decades. There were too many unanswered questions. How had a missing vehicle gone unnoticed by an entire construction crew? How had the pit not been inspected, photographed, or measured before? Concrete was poured? How did no one notice a Pontiac-sized depression in the foundation afterward? Even more troubling were the forensic inconsistencies. The car showed no signs of the violent impact one would expect from an accidental plunge. The seatbelts were unbuckled. The gear shift was in neutral. The positioning of the bodies suggested the passengers hadn't braced or panicked. It looked more like a moment frozen mid-conversation than a crash. Yet, officially, the sheriff's department closed the file that spring, citing insufficient evidence of foul play. They released a short statement to the press calling it a tragic accident and urging the community to honor the memory of 3 young lives lost too soon. Behind the scenes, though, several investigators privately admitted they weren't convinced. Some suspected negligence on the part of the original contractors. Others hinted that someone had helped bury the truth, literally. But with the main suspect, Paul Henders, dead, and no surviving witnesses willing to speak, the case had nowhere else to go. The announcement divided Lincoln County. For the older generation who had lived through the hysteria of 1992, it was closure, painful but final. For the families, it felt like another betrayal. Nikki's mother, Eleni, refused to attend the press briefing. She told reporters later, "Accidents don't pour concrete." Joseph's brother, now a seasoned officer in the same department that had once searched for him, sat at the back of the conference room that day, his jaw clenched as the sheriff read the ruling aloud. William's mother wept quietly, not because of the words, but because of how empty they sounded. That fall, Lincoln County organized a memorial unlike any the town had seen before. It was held at the high school auditorium, the same building where the 3 had once taken prom photos on a May evening no one could forget. The walls were decorated with their senior portraits, restored and enlarged. The auditorium lights were dim, just enough to illuminate the faces frozen in time. Hundreds attended. Former classmates returned from out of state. Teachers from the old staff, some retired, came in quietly and took seats in the back rows. At the front of the stage, 3 candles flickered beneath framed photos of Joseph, William, and Nikki, each candle representing the years of searching that had never stopped. The principal spoke about youth and time. The sheriff spoke about closure and healing. But when Eleni Bacoles stood to speak, the room fell completely silent. Her voice trembled, but every word carried the weight of a quarter-century of grief. She said her daughter's bracelet had come back from the lab, wrapped in a plastic evidence bag, polished, tagged, cataloged, but still warm from being held. "That's not an accident," she said softly. "That's a cover." No one in the room argued. Even those who wanted to believe. The official report couldn't ignore how neatly it tied up a story that had never been neat. How a car, a slab, and an entire generation's guilt could be sealed under paperwork just as easily as it had been under concrete. After the service, the families gathered at the cemetery on the edge of town. The 3 were laid to rest side by side, their caskets lowered into the earth beneath a gray autumn sky. It had been 25 years since the night they disappeared, 25 years of unanswered calls, fruitless searches, and a silence that stretched across generations. For a moment, it felt like the town itself exhaled, as if the ground had been holding its breath all that time. People lingered long after the ceremony ended, touching the headstones, leaving flowers, tracing names that had once been printed on milk cartons and flyers. That night, the story ran nationwide one final time. Anchors called it a haunting conclusion to one of Ohio's oldest mysteries. But for those who lived in Lincoln County, the truth didn't feel like a conclusion. It felt like a compromise. The following week, construction resumed at the site where the car had been found. The pit was filled, leveled, and paved into a storage lot for a shipping company. Workers said the ground there always felt strange, softer somehow, even under fresh asphalt. And though the official report closed the case with certainty, those who had grown up under its shadow never forgot the details that didn't fit. The slab poured overnight, the rushed paperwork, the man who took secrets to his grave. In the end, the story of Joseph, William, and Nikki remained half told, suspended between accident and intent, closure and conspiracy. The last image the town clung to was of the three friends smiling in their prom photos, frozen in 1992, eyes full of plans for a future they never reached. Time moved on, roads were repaved, buildings rose and fell. But somewhere beneath it all, under decades of concrete and silence, the truth still waited, heavy, buried, and unresolved.